Well, I can also say that I live in a dysfunctional environment where I can spell out as I did, I don't know what to do with this, I'm dealing this with this, this is this, this is this. I can do this, I can't do that, I don't know what to do here. And I can say all of that, and I can put it on a video, I can put it in an email, I can write it in a book, and absolutely no one that I know wants to A, engage with it, and B, knows what to do. Right? So, the best trauma therapists, Bessel van der Kolk, they acknowledge that because we have been blocking this science as a culture for the past 100 years, preferring to shame veterans rather than develop the science, preferring to ban psychedelics rather than develop the science, and all of this, that we as a culture are profoundly sociopathic and dysfunctional, and that I'm doing maybe 3 times better than the culture, but still don't know what to do, right? So if anyone in my culture was competent and intelligent and empathic and had come forward and said, oh, Dane, right? Here's how you love this child in a way that works. Here's how you get through this stuff that works. I would have loved them. I would have hung on to them. I would have excitedly gone through, and I would love to be sharing all of this technique, right? But that's not what happened, right? The more I communicated, right, the more people moved away and avoided and said, oh, well, everyone has to do their own path, right? i.e., we don't want to get involved with helping you with these difficult things because we haven't figured it out for ourselves. Or we do know how to figure it out, but we're sociopathic and don't want to be bothered helping you, right? So when everyone does that to everyone, right, you have large amounts of traumatic symptoms which hurt everyone. One of the biggest expenses of our economy. I had to shut my business down for a year and a half coping with the worst of this, right? Right? And when a therapist responds to learning, like when I would tell therapists about the illegal abusive activity of Peter Sandhill and the Human Awareness Institute, not a single one of them said, well, let's try and bring awareness to that, or let me, advocate for you, or let's go to the police, or no, they all said, oh, just pay me a lot of money to talk about it. Despite the fact that talk therapy doesn't work, and it's enraging to keep paying therapists to deal with dysfunctional therapists, particularly when therapists have one of the worst accountability and refund policies of any business. Right? I have never encountered a therapist, however dysfunctional, and there are many within and without the Lazaris community that are dysfunctional. One of the worst therapeutic experiences of my life was a Lazaris therapist who hated men, who was recommended by a Lazaris friend who was a woman. So she said, talk to her. So I listened to 4 hours of how everything in the whole world was men's fault, and got a large bill, and bravo, right? So it gets pretty sickening at some point. When I realized that the therapists that I'd paid had given me more childhood wounding and pain than any other person in my adult life, and that the impacts were more severe and debilitating than any other person in my adult life, I naturally felt both very frightened of my own competency to pick people, right? Because when 4 of your therapists gang up to enact the abuse and silence you, the obvious conclusion is I don't know how to pick therapists. Fine, wonderful. What the fuck do you do with that? When everyone says go to a therapist, and you're smart enough to realize you don't know how to pick therapists, what the fuck do you do with that? Right? And it's wrong it is wrong to have a protocol where therapists can fuck you up and other therapists are just interested in being paid to talk about it and not interested in stopping the abuse. Not a single therapist was interested in seeing that other people didn't get abused by their colleagues. Right? So they're all light healers, energy workers, all this and that, right? That don't want to be bothered by negativity, right? Well, that's how we have a fucked up world. So if everyone around is incompetent and teaches incompetent protocols, you get incompetent children and next generation. So I am an incompetent child and next generation of a highly sociopathic and incompetent culture, right? Where I could write to concept synergy and they're just rude, right? It's worse dealing with concept because they're treated so badly by Jach. Right? They're paid so poorly. They have had, minimal results in their own life from all the Lazaris techniques. They don't want to deal with some other person's problem and they don't know how. Right? And so the message is like, what's wrong with me that this great spiritual organization and all that can, but it isn't. It isn't a great spiritual organization, right? It's an eclectic mix of, normally abused people that haven't had the techniques work for them any more than anyone else. And so there it is. So that seems healthier than dumping shame on myself for not knowing any better. To say, hey, I'm a dysfunctional person trained by a dysfunctional culture in which not a single person seems to know a better protocol that they're willing to voice and or have any accountability around, right? Because there have been over 100 people in my life who listen to 3 or 4 minutes of what I'm saying and say, oh, I know just the thing for you, go and do this. And then they're not around to talk about the gaseous results of eating raw food and the disgusting taste as opposed to the transcendent experience. And they're not around to talk about how this crystal did not actually heal the whole neighborhood. There's just as much bullying and dysfunction in the neighborhood as there was before. And this workshop did not transform life to more miracles and blah, 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 blah. It just racked up some credit card debt. And all of this work did not do this, and no, that didn't click, and no, this, right? And they don't want to hear about it. Yeah. I want to just save you with a one-off. Read this book. Read this book. It will change your life. Okay, you see them 10, 20 years later. How's your life changed? Now they have a new book, right? Read this book. Everyone has got to read this book, right? It's so impactful, right? But the country is going downhill after all the people read that book, right? They don't want to talk about it, right? And I find this actually quite lonely, right? The quick fix rescuers, and nobody wants to go deeply in, right? I've done it many times. And I did it actually with my wife. It's how we ended up getting married. I saw someone in pain. I decided to be helpful. She was miraculously responsive to one person, the only person in her life showing up that seemed to know anything. I just spent 20 or 30 minutes a day until her life went up by 700%. And I thought, wow, this is an amazing human being who's just been waiting for one competent person to advise them. And it's fun watching someone's life go up, right? So she has been more successful than me in many ways. In terms of percentage return on investment, because I know how to solve those problems and I enjoy doing it and I enjoy watching her happiness and joy and growth. I don't know how to solve my problems and she doesn't know how to solve them, and nobody I've met knows how to solve these physiological riddles. So I just work on it, best I can. I would say that I'm in a at least 300% healthier place than I was when all of this happened. I try and harness both my self-pity, my righteous indignation, my outrage, my criticism, to go beyond me, the particular individual, but to advocate for people in these horrific situations that have fewer choices than I do, right? Because I think it is sociopathic and cruel to induce a child into the fear of death if they fight for their own boundaries, and then tell them they create their own reality and not tell them how to work with that physiology, and to not check in with, is it working and why? And to basically say that all boils down to, your payoffs and all of that. It may or may not have elements of truth. Most things you can look at have use or truth from some perspective. It's just if it doesn't work and it induces more shame and more loneliness, and you don't bother to check in that it's not working, and there's a divergence between your dogma and the statistical reality, then it is sociopathic to continue to maintain that dogma in the face of the data. And that's really my biggest criticism of Lazaris, the Lazaris community and concept synergy, is the chronic failure to gather and share data as the first step in an iterative response to what does work beautifully, what works but is crazy-making, what makes sense and isn't crazy-making but doesn't work at all, what's shaming. How many people have felt shamed by this and that? How many people have actually said, gee, now I know how to create my whole reality the way that I'd like it? This is enormously painful. I would say that 40% of my existence is mind and body numbing pain and terror of that amount of pain. And, fear of death from an abuser. Now, obviously, in a dysfunctional culture that is not going to do anything about that to teach your parents, is not going to do anything about that to teach you in school. You go to work, and now the idea of professional is you leave all your personal stuff at home. In other words, you dump the culture shit on the kid, right? You distract them and shame them for dealing with traumatic symptoms at school. And then you tell them to leave all that behind and focus on helping other people to make money off and doing dumb shit that doesn't help anyone. And then you go to therapists who abuse you or do this and that, and then you feel miserable and deal with the dysfunction of the very sociopathic medical system. Then, what? You retire in loneliness and confusion and bitterness and grief at wasting your whole life with so much of that? It's a very, very lonely, dry, dead protocol for a living being to go through. It is the best that the universe has created at this time out of this, material, and in this time and space. This is the winning thing. But it's very, very painful. I'm not, Lazaris has said your bottom line is the price you must pay to have all the success. But Lazaris is also plenty tricky, right? Because, you'd think, maybe I can deal with this big discrepancy, and maybe I can deal with the fact there wasn't a click, and maybe I can see how one leads to another. So if one leads to the other, why should one be more real? Like if there wasn't the shame part, there wouldn't have been the resentful, punishing unfairness part, the part that realized they couldn't win against mom and dad, and that it was an unfair, rigged system. So that part wouldn't have existed without the first wounding in an unfair environment. So if the one doesn't exist without the other, why is it an either-or choice in Lazaris's mind? And without the helpless dynamic of resentment and kind of martyrhood or whatever, there wouldn't be the excitement about control. Like the whole excitement about control is going from, it's fucked up, I'm always going to be bullied, I'm always going to get the short end of the stick because I'm always going to avoid conflict because I don't want to fear death, because I'm in a sociopathic environment where some people are always going to exploit, not everyone and not all the time, but when it suits them, I'm going to end up this. That creates hurt and bitterness, hurt at the betrayal of the empathic brain, bitterness that I can't retaliate without hurting myself even more than the retaliation and without hurting them, because sociopaths are not hurt when I hold up my boundary. They just go and exploit someone else. They could give a shit. But I experience the symptoms that I'm going to die. Right? So I lose either way. I lose with the feeling I'm going to die, or I lose with being bullied, and I resent being in that situation. I want to punish the world for putting me in that situation. Right? So there's the punishment. And that's not very satisfying. It's not fun to be punishing, right? It's fun to win, right? So then that leads to saying, ooh, if I just write a contract and the shame flips back. In other words, if you show someone all the areas that they're lying and stealing and cheating, particularly if you have any rank in the culture and might talk to other people, right? Then they very quickly either make some little amend and go abuse someone else, basically, which is, to me, a sickening realization, right? That basically the most vulnerable, weakest person in a sociopathic gets the most hostility. And so, I'm not stopping hostility in the world, right? I'm just shifting it to a weaker person. And that, that enrages me. It's unjust, it's cruel, it's wrong, and it's how it happens in the Lazaris community, it's how it happens out of the Lazaris community. And Lazaris is doing shit to actually address and deal with the grief, the sadness, the rage, that's the dynamic. Well, it is the dynamic, right? Deal with it. Right? Stop blaming people for being in that dynamic. So, right? I don't know how to how to do that other than to take a beating enough of a time to deal reserves, to start while being beaten up and traumatized, try to learn a better way, to try and navigate to resources. It's very, very frightening in adolescence to move out of an abusive house, which I did at age 17. Very painful, very frightening, very lonely. And had to go against conventional wisdom almost constantly. And that's also disconcerting, to realize that I can ask every grown-up in the mix, what do you think about the decision here and here? And they can all be wrong and disinterested in discussing it. So I have to go out on my own, right? And when I realized that I was right, it's like, gosh, all these grown-ups are colluding to misguide all of these kids, most of whom don't have the courage or are not miserable enough to take the risk. What a lonely reality, incredibly lonely. But then again, Lazaris said that this lifetime was chosen to deal with loneliness. So I guess I'm succeeding in Lazaris's, somewhat twisted definition of success. How does consciously creating success and consciously creating fun equate with dealing with loneliness? Well, Lazaris didn't have enough time to explain that. sometimes half-truths are worse, or incomplete truths are worse than none. Right? I'm not catching on how this is leading to conscious success or fun. But then Lazaris can just say that their techniques work, whether they do or not, and that's the end of the topic, right? So, so understanding how I got to control, I know exactly why I control. I know why I control much less in Thailand, because so much more is happening the way that I enjoy it happening, and it is such a relief, right? It's such a relief not to have to scan for hostility and scan for being taken advantage, that there's, and not be interrupted. And it's just such a warm and courteous culture. So beautiful. So, so I have not gotten closer to the bottom line, and I am not clearer, having, worked with that yellow label, of how I would give up. So let's say we give up control. Well, I've tried that multiple times, because it is quite a bother to think about how people are going to push me into situations, and it just goes right back. And I say, well, it is a cost to have to make the effort to control, but I'd rather not have anything to do with most people at all if I don't pay that price, and I'd like to engage some with the world. So I will negotiate agreements and spend time with the people that keep them. So I've gone back to, the punishing anger, but I find that a useful clue. Like when I'm angry that this and this is wrong, I look at it and I say, absolutely right. I'd be furious about that too if I'm, I totally get it. That is exactly how anyone is going to feel if they're in a powerless dynamic with a bully who isn't fair, right? So the question then becomes how to control, how to strategize to be not around those people and around someone else. Well, that's the answer, right? So that rage, that resentment is a guide up. I've got to pay some attention to more control. And I could just stay in the, it's all my fault, I'm completely unlovable, down here. But I think that the angry resentment about the unfairness is a big step forward. Rather than blame myself, fuck you, you dysfunctional assholes that had 5 kids without reading any manuals on intergenerational abuse and just dumping your shit while pretending to be new age heroes. Fuck you. Right? So that's I feel better immediately. There's a little bit of adrenaline, whatever. I've spent so much of my life in that. I see progress. So then you go back to this and you say, well, why? This is the bottom line, right? The shame, right? The abuse, the shame, the terror, the self-hate, the self-blame. That's the bottom line. So I have to give that up. Now, this actually, is actually the first insight area I've had in this entire territory. And this is one of the reasons I make videos, is occasionally this happens. What about giving that up? Well, I guess the first question is how, when it's so deeply woven into the physiology. How? I would love to be able to have assertive, healthy interaction. I can visualize myself with a warm sense of humor and genuine presence, saying, hey, why you want to be so punishing in this dynamic? Let's have a good time. And with enough presence and self-energy, many people will pivot from being manipulative assholes into, they know the game is called, they know they don't have to, they see there's a pleasant alternative, and I'm not doing that. Instead, I see a manipulative asshole type energy, and I go deeper into that energy, and then they exploit it. So it's a collaborative dynamic. And to prevent that, I do a lot of control, to stop, to bring that to awareness. But that's what I'm holding on to in my body is those terror memories. So why not just give that up? Oh, great idea. It's reduced my well-being by 40% my entire life. All my anger and resentment in my entire life comes from the fact that I willingly choose not to assert boundaries to avoid fearing death and having a death-inducing anxiety, like the car dynamic. So, so that's, I've never been in a point where that starts to happen and I've said, well, there's just this switch and then I feel great. Because people do read energy, and serial killers, serial rapists, they say they can spot a person in a abused state like that, and they will target that person. And I can say with certainty, because I have at times been in a great state with support, meaning when people treat me well for a while, and I'm well sexed and well moneyed, and people are treating me well, and an abuser comes along, I can easily not be in that state, right? But when one client punishes me into deep anxiety, and then I'm afraid of dying because I nearly got in a car accident, and then I have less money because of this, and then the economy is going into depression, and I'm going down and down, and somebody new wants to abuse me. I have no ability to just push that aside, right? So I just watch myself be exploited and resent it, because I would rather that than have a dissociative episode where the fear of dying is so intense that it's way worse than putting up with the minor, cruelty of narcissistic people. So this is, so why not give this up? Because this is the source of the others. Well, of course, the 2-year-old, the 5-year-old is not going to do that. You take my parents would do the Hansel and Gretel dynamic. They'd take me out into the forest, and when I was disoriented and lost, they would hide until I burst into tears of terror. And then they would laugh and humiliate that terror and find it amusing. I don't know any 5-year-old who's been beaten and hit and isolated who would not be traumatized by basically repeated abandonment games that were led, by humiliation, and in a dynamic where nothing fair could be given back to the abuser, and there's no safe person to turn to. That will do it, by the way. I don't care, what bullshit statistics that anyone, in New Age and all their positive attitude stuff. If you will give 1,000 children to my parents, they managed to induce traumatic various expressions of that in all 5 of their children. If you will give 1,000 children to my parents to just isolate them all, right? And beat them, tell them horrible mythology stories that terrify them, talk to them about, and just completely isolate them, and then play abandonment games and hit them, and then block all protest and punish all protests. I think that I think my parents would be incredibly efficient at inducing that state by age 5. So they were, and they did. It's absolutely stupid and cruel to blame that kid. But that's what creating your own reality, and you chose that when there's no memory of ever choosing that, kind of does. And so now Lazaris is basically saying, why don't I just give it up? Well, I don't know how. I've never known how. And the Lazaris techniques have not been useful, right? understanding that that is at least as much relating to the incompetence of the Lazaris community, my culture, and Lazaris is a useful circle, right? I think it is delusional and marginally insane to isolate one part of any system and scapegoat it, right? It's all an illusion. It's all your creation. Well, that's one way of saying it, right? But you're basically scapegoating everyone for a collaborative ecology that includes, a large number of dysfunctional protocols on Lazaris's part, which includes failure to gather information and say, because it's one thing to say, aspirin helps 98% of people. So if you take aspirin, there's a 98% chance you will have less of a headache. But there are these little minor complications for some people, and if your blood is too thin, don't do it. That's a fair thing to say, and you know that, you know your risks. But what about Lazaris shames 90% of Lazaris friends who end up identifying with the abused child in an abused culture and asking, what's wrong with me that I created this? What about Lazaris shames 90% of Lazaris friends? And so if you have exposure to Lazaris, you have a 90% chance of feeling mildly crazy, of feeling like you can't talk about Lazaris to anyone else around you because they would tell you you're mildly crazy. And so it's a dissociative. What about those statistics? And there's a good chance you'll have some good jokes and you'll have some techniques that would be good. And there'll be a lot of interesting ideas. What about those statistics? These are the counterindications. But of course, Lazaris is choosing not to gather them or share them. That's dysfunctional. That's sociopathic if it enables one person after another to think that it's all their fault that the techniques aren't working, which would be the obvious thing to conclude if I was not trauma literate. But it is a good question. If I was able to let go of this terror, then I could healthily assert myself. If I could healthily assert myself, I would no longer be enraged by bullies because I would just pat them off, right? Okay, you're a bully. Doesn't bother me. Fine, go, I'm going to live a great life. As opposed to, God damn it, another fucking bully. Now I have to choose to get all worked up or just put up with one little stuff after another. Now I have to go find another person because most people have a bullying side, right? If you give a doorway, right? My mistake with this client was when she first bullied me, I gave her something to appease her. She said, oh, good, I'm going to bully you some more, right? And then punish you for not giving me even more, right? So, if I'd had a little bit more reserve there to just feel the terror of death and just say, no, this is in the contract, I would have trained her better to bully somebody else, right? Because she's a bully when she can get away with it, but she's perfectly fine when she can't, right? So, that's something I can learn. And so that is something I'm learning. But it's still not getting away from the fact that I would fear death while I was doing that. And I've gotten sick with that fear on multiple times where I have actually drawn the line. What you're doing is not what we agreed. What? You mean I can't get free work? No. There is actually a contract. Right? So, I have to deal with the rage and hostility every time there in her body and her resentment, paying her bill, it's endlessly punishing one way or another. But, the worst thing is to appease and then be punished even more for appeasing, right? And now you've got less money because you gave some free stuff, and they're even more punishing because they thought that works. And then they're even more punishing because they don't respect you because you caved in. So you just get triple punished and have less, right? So that's, a dynamic. And again, it would be the easiest thing in the world without this physiology to just say, hey, well, what world are you in? Where people don't pay for work. Hello, you're 70 years old. And that probably put a stop to it. Resentfully, but put a stop to it. But that just brings up this incredible tension in my belly, and there's nothing there able to say those words. Did you work with the contract? Okay, well, is 10 times working with the contract tapes of shame? 20 times? Like, at what point does it just become an exercise in martyrhood and futility to continually pretend that all the Lazaris techniques work wonderfly and you're just not doing them right, particularly when you have evidence that other techniques work much better. But it's still a hugely complex and mysterious territory, right? I don't know what's the best technique for that. But I have gotten sick and been punished. How to let that go? And that is by far the best thing to work with. So the best thing that I know, number one, is microdosing mushrooms to get in touch with self that isn't in that state. Right? As soon as the mushroom wears off, though, and the next punishment wave, it goes right back. But that is, microdosing is huge in that area. So that's, everything else falls out of that, right? And so that is the point to work with, right? Because as long as control protects me from that horrific sensation that is locked in the body as a traumatic memory, then control will be a blessing more than it is, a dirty word, because it's leading to the ability to engage in balanced ways with at least some people who are willing to make and keep agreements. But what a fun thing not to have to control people or be as affected by that, and just to, laugh it off would be heaven. Not have to resent it and ruminate about how unfair. That would be heaven, because I ruminate, right? That part of me that could never do anything. And then I have to say, okay, what do I do to make this better? Right. So, fuck Lazaris' idea about worrying about how being a terrified, shame-based 5-year-old has hurt all these other people. Yes, it has. And we live in a culture where we do not protect shame-based 5-year-olds. And that's a perfectly clear loop. If we as a culture betray, shame, and punish and traumatize isolated, terrified 5-year-olds, then 5-year-olds will be isolated and terrified. Isolated, terrified 5-year-olds that can't fight for themselves in a sociopathic environment will be abused and are abused, and will resent it passively, aggressively, enormously. And once they can, if they can move from the victim resentment way to either the bully, or in my case, just asserting healthy boundaries and taking a lower rank position to avoid being targeted, they will do so, right? That is absolutely healthy, natural development for an abused child in a sociopathic cult. Now, if people don't want to be punished by abused children in sociopathic cults, they're actually going to have to, because that cannot be placed on the child, they're actually going to have to grow up and become better parents. And we will have to actually teach competent parenting in high school rather than shame people for demonstrating traumatic symptoms from abusive parents, right? In other words, you could say that the world is not worthy of being treated well by the children it traumatizes and violates. And whether it is worthy or not, it will not be treated well. And that this is a wake-up call for a cult to either go extinct or evolve into something that will. And that the misery, the unhappiness, and the backlash of the child and teenagers are the healthiest thing about our cult, because the cult itself is rotten. And the child is being honest, and the teenager is expressing hostility at the amount of cruelty given to them in the name of love. So, Lazaris, I think, has done a pretty slim, weak job of teaching competent parenting. My parents did not improve in parenting in the slightest as a result of the Lazaris material. They just started asking me at age 13 why I was creating their abuse, right? So, bravo, Lazaris. You're able to take narcissistic idiot parents and make them more abusive, and tell the victim that they're creating that and you chose those parents so that they can't retaliate because the parents know what you said as well. So bravo, right? Pretty dumb, not effective. And so you get this, right? This is my passive, angry adolescent. Fuck you, Lazaris, you son of a bitch. Right? It feels a little better than wondering what's wrong with me. Doesn't solve it either. I'm not pretending to be competent in this area, right? It's just we have to start by acknowledging that it just takes a few competent people. And if not one of them is to be found, in or out of the Lazaris community, well, then we will keep making mistakes until we figure it out, right? Sometime in the next million years, I'm sure we'll stop shaming people for being traumatized and punishing them for being punished, and beating them up for telling the truth, and then we'll have a heavenly outcome, right? So much more fun to be in an empathic rather than sociopathic relationship, with superabundance rather than sociopathic competing for scarce resources created by an incompetent protocol. So, that's, life is doing its job to iterate. That's, I can go between that. It's all my fault we have to grow up and deal with this circle together. And if we're not able and willing to do that, don't blame it on any one person. We're all doing what we can, right? And hopefully, if Lazaris could do better than they're doing, they would be doing it. So they aren't and they can't. So, but I am not and I can't, and you're not and you can't, right? So, right, what do we have? We have a slow, iterative process. It's going to take, maybe a generation raised with microdosing and traumatic literature in the next 100 years is going to alleviate half of this. That'd be amazing, right? And so then the culture will become 50% more empathic, 50% less sociopathic. Amazing, right? But how to do it when it's in your body. So I would say that not through any click, but just the process of elimination and going back to the core. I don't enjoy controlling. I don't enjoy punishing. I don't enjoy shivering and terror. And none of those things would be happening without this happening. I certainly do not blame or shame my child for this. I think it's a confusing outrage, this whole thing of you picking all of this. I wish Lazaris would shut up about that, or at least acknowledge the crazy-making element of it, the demand that you trust Lazaris without any evidence, right? That's just Lazaris talking about you, and which would be just as crazy if I told Lazaris what his reality was like and why he didn't choose to be physical, that he had no memory of, right? Well, I guess it's one opinion. But I think a little humility. Maybe you chose your parents because of this, or maybe that. Yeah, but I don't like the smugness implied in we just have orgasms all the time. We chose not to be physical. You could have grown just as much without suffering, and yet you just keep choosing this suffering thing. Basically, we did it much better than you, and we'll stand by and watch you all suffer for decades and tell you how our techniques work, whether they do or not, right? And that's not the vibe that Lazaris sends out, right? But that is an element of what is happening, and it's not a nice element. So anyway, this is the place then. This is the place. So if I'm able to shift my physiology through maybe martial arts, through microdosing, like this part never wants to exercise because it's frozen and doesn't want to be in its body, right? So I have to have a discipline to go out and get in my body and do things. When I do, I get stronger and this goes down. But whenever I want to know who I am, right, and this is why I also think it's linked with image and stuff, traumatized people dissociate easily, and so they want to ground to something that feels solid, and it's often the misery of the traumatic event that feels most solid. And the more traumatized a person is, the more they will cling to the most solid thing, and the most solid thing is always negative for a traumatized person. So you need an identity, you need a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that has some solidity. The strongest patterns are negative patterns, right? So, so I understand when I'm disoriented and confused why I go back to feeling tight and numb in my body. And then I know who I am. Yeah. Anyway, this last piece is great. This is the foundation of the other adaptions. And so I would say it's a mixture of loneliness. It's incredibly lonely to be punished for being punished and to be punished for demonstrating the symptoms of being punished, and to be isolated. It's incredibly shaming to have a larger energy violate psychologically and physically. It's very traumatic and anxiety producing. Loneliness could be slightly more than shame, right? That's actually one of the reasons that I like making these videos is as an antidote to loneliness. I do not like the fact that 99% of the most vulnerable and important thoughts and feelings and ideas of my life are invisible to the entire world because we don't have a deeply inviting culture. We have a don't ask, don't tell culture. And not a single person who says, "How you doing?" will make the time and show the interest to listen to this. And we've created a busy cult to make sure that as I begin, people rush off and say, "Oh, I've got to go." So I don't like the loneliness that comes with everything important being invisible. And I don't like the loneliness in the Lazaris forum, that any implication that Lazaris might have the slightest incompetence or that other things work better is negative ego and shouldn't be heard and blah, blah, blah. I don't like the loneliness of being silenced and buried. The question is, since self was there sloshing around as kind of a vague sense of self, and then this terror and pain blocked and attacked the self as the child shamed and blamed themselves for the violence. I lost myself in that first wave. And I never met myself again until age 40, up in here. And I had no idea what Lazaris was talking about until I met myself with the help of mushrooms, which, again, you would think the most enlightened being in the universe would point their friends to the more effective technique, and that, if in 10 hours you can meet yourself and in 20 years of Lazaris you can't, right? It's kind of the friendly thing to do to point you in the right direction. And I'm just angry. It took, to age 40 to meet myself. And I'm still wrestling day by day, how to bring self into the dynamic, and because when I'm afraid of being punished, I'm not in the self. When I'm punishing, I'm not in the self. When I'm controlling, I'm not in the self. And when I'm in this terrified small place, I'm not in the self. So that's where it was first erased, blocked over. And going back to that thought on the body, these arthritic cells are not at fault, right? I'm sure they're blaming themselves if the fractal pattern of consciousness works. And maybe Lazaris would, talk to them about how they're creating their own reality and they could choose not to be arthritic and all that. But how can they exactly if the whole body ego, don't have a more intelligent way to deal with that emotional territory? How? Right? Well, if you take that a step further, and you can say that I'm a small cell in the species, well, the species is filled with arthritis and hostility and narcissism and all these things, because the species has not figured out how to transcend and have a more fun and successful way of engaging. So how can I turn to myself as part of this species and say, We don't teach trauma to parents. We don't teach trauma to school. None of the people I talk to are interested in doing anything about that. I haven't had any good role models that would guide me to show how to deal with this, this, and this. Lazaris spouts about it, but Jack and Penny and all that don't live it. So, and if, and where's the exact details of it, right? So, how the fuck is one cell in a species going to do, to avoid the arthritis that is being caused at a species level? And then you go up to the higher self and look at all the probability fields. So if in all those probability fields, there's all these painful lifetimes and all these shaming lifetimes and all these reptilian lifetimes and all these, raping lifetimes, and that's the higher self's, all these lifetimes out there, and the higher self has some that are arthritic and some that are healthy, and that's the best the higher self can do, right? If the self gives birth to all of these personas and just vacates as soon as there's this terrified little one and the self just disappears, do you blame the 5-year-old? Or do you say, what the fuck is wrong with this all-present self that leaves the moment the child is in traumatic terror? You see the problem? Right? And if Lazaris creates universe and stands by as the vast majority of his friends remain in their chronic patterns, decade after decade after decade, and Lazaris doesn't find this worth mentioning or doing anything about, do you say, what's wrong with the Lazaris friends? Or do you say, well, why not create a universe? Lazaris, do what you say. Create that dominion world, right, where people go into that. A nice image, by the way. Very nice. I felt that, energy of creating that world and going into that. So that's actually a very lovely possibility. And no doubt, giving up the bottom line would take me a lot closer to that. I've never talked about this to anyone in this depth. Therapists interrupt, don't get it. Lazaris doesn't have much of a dialogue dynamic. And when we talked, I think I talked for 3 minutes, and Lazaris talked for 27 minutes. So, anyway, it's interesting to feel a visceral sense. That's a possibility. There's another universe without this. But, I guess I want, I think that the healthiest dynamic is not to shame and blame the child and pretend, as Lazaris does, that the whole universe is resonating in love and resonance except you, and that's because you chose that. The you that you have no idea what he's talking about. That is the exact opposite of the you that you know, right? Because me, if you said, Dane, would you like to be born in the next lifetime with kind, empathic parents who were trauma literate and would love seeing you grow up and could have a strong family? Or would you like to choose another narcissistic, sociopathic parent and suffer for 40 years and have various people tell you how it could all be changed by changing any number of things? I would, in a heartbeat choose the more loving parents, as I think most people would, right? Which makes it mildly crazy-making for Lazaris to say, no, you, the exact opposite of the you that you know, actually did this. But you didn't have to. So I guess carry your stupidity for life. That's one thing. And then, of course, the other thing is, if you get rid of this bottom line, you've still got to get your beliefs right, your raw materials clean, your chakras clean, your this. In other words, you can do this endless thing for the next 30 years. And there's, I would say, low but moderate evidence that, that this is moving into great territory. That there's, it's certainly none of this can be done simultaneously and anything near perfectly. And I think I also fear I find it very lonely for Lazaris to basically say, in this relationship, we have nothing to do with your failure and everything to do with your success. Like, if you fuck up, that's your problem. But if you are helped by our wonderful techniques that work so amazingly, well, we create universes in our spare time. That seems an incredibly lonely dynamic. So I'm afraid of being all alone. I felt blamed and judged and all alone. I felt abandoned and it's all my fault. I'm afraid of, trying all of this stuff and basically just, no matter what I do and how much I fail, Lazaris will just say, well, we love you and we'll always be there with you and our techniques work. So what's wrong with me? So I think that's where a lot of this emphasis on, no, I'm not going to enter that shame-based delusion. I'm going to enter a science-based reality where, in the same way that my wife just needed one competent adult in her entire life to give her an opportunity to know the science of trauma. I never told her she created her reality. She's gotten 4,000% increased life skills and 700% increase in well-being, and become an amazing person by using the science of statistics and trauma literature and what worked, and because one person finally gave a damn. And that's all she needed, right? And I'm slowly transitioning out of more of a parental role. It's a process, right? Because when you want to commit suicide by age 7 and are in so much pain you're pulling out your own hair to get some sense of agency in a profoundly cruel environment, well, it takes a little time with a stunted body and that amount of hate to learn what loving parenting is. But it just took one person. And my life is way better. I would say my life is 250% better because I helped this person. Right? And the best techniques were the trauma literature and making sure that every month she is more competent and more powerful logistically in an earned way, building muscle, working, learning skills, learning skills, having responsibilities, gaining power through confidence and competence, and gaining truth. None of this is your fault. Your parents were even more fucked up than my parents. And so when I see that it just took one person, me, and that's why I did it. I was so angry at the time that I did not have a single competent adult, and that even my therapists were doing their bullshitty blame the client, blame the child dynamic, that I thought, let's be what I resent doesn't exist for me. Let's be that. So I did. And it did not take much, right? So thousands of impressions of abuse and trauma, 2 totally dysfunctional parents, a nest of dysfunctional siblings induced by dysfunctional parents, a shaming church, a sociopathic culture, public humiliation, you name it. And one person who gave a damn shifted most of that. Physiology starts changing. She used to be able to thrashing around all night. Now she's still, right? Used to hate herself. Now she loves herself. It's all it took. One fucking person who's as immature as I am. That's all it took. One. Right? Probably mostly organized by my 12-year-old. Well, if one fucking 12-year-old with all this hostility can help someone reach this point, why shame all these individual people? Why not just say it is quite a shame that there has been no adult in my life willing or as competent as my 12-year-old was to her, right? But it is encouraging. It's beautiful to honor the human spirit, because that's why I fell in love with her, right? There was no lust or compatibility dynamic. I just thought, well, rather than resent the world for being so incompetent, be the person and see if it works. I believe, because I was wrestling, I thought, I just need one person, one person who's advocating for me to help me get through this terror, to comfort me that I won't die, that one person that actually bothers to listen. So I did for her exactly what I knew would work for me, but nobody was willing to do. Right? I had her write down her entire life story from birth to the present time. I read all of it, understood all of it, and began responding as I thought a trauma-literate, competent adult would. And even though I felt terrified and small a lot of the time, even though I was at times jealous that she was getting what I've always wanted, she blessed me with her love and presence and return to innocence in the face of love. That worked. I tried exposing her to Lazaris. She's not interested. But that actually worked. And I'm very, very encouraged by that. If all it takes is one competent adult to erase 20 years of abuse on all sides, and it can be done in months to years, well, we all need to be learning that protocol so we can give it to the abused members of the next generation that we've abandoned. And how about that for a bottom line? That would be useful, right? That this is something we can give the species if we have an interest in reading The Body Keeps the Score and other books on trauma, taking the time to ask questions and see the people we're in relationship with before we exert our influence and our judgment. I've asked over 100 women to do what she did. I said, please, Write out your user's manual. Write out the things that really matter to you. Won't do it, right? Won't do it. But that is a far more useful tool than anything I know from Lazaris in that situation. The Lazaris Healing the Inner Child work was very useful because that had helped me, and so I taught her that, and that did help her, and so that's great. Mushrooms also helped her, but mostly it's just years of systematic skill building and becoming competent and experiencing praise and validation and power that comes from competence. So I've got some things to think about here. I'm still confused about why the self can't show up, but I do want to also say that in highly dysfunctional environments, the self is the enemy of the survival part. For example, the self knows that it's not to blame for the parent's cruelty and understands that the parent is in fear and is in pain. And that is highly threatening to the defending parts, the defensive identities within the parent abuser that do not want mirroring of the pain they're trying to avoid because they don't know how to deal with it. So the self that brings about that presence and start inducing tears and inducing healthy movement in the parent is attacked by the parent's defensive parts. And that attack doesn't stop until the self is banished, and what is left is a crippled, apologetic, fear-based part that does not seem to be a threat to the parent's protector part. And the self of a 5-year-old is not willing or able to withstand that barrage and say, no, I'm not going to leave you that traumatized part. There's some part in the abuser that wants to see the terror, that wants to see the loneliness, that wants to see the submission, or it will continue the beating. And the self breaks that pattern and is filled with radiance and forgiveness and empathy and understanding, and that enrages the punisher protector of the abuser. And so the self is asked to go down into the shadow, which makes this part completely and utterly alone, because there's no outer self, there's no inner self, just completely and utterly alone. But, looking at it from maybe a 5-year-old's point of view, I'm angry that myself left me, right? So even though there's a quick get into this place so we don't be hit more, I'm still angry that it left. Like, why couldn't it come up with a we'll secretly love you. Just learn to lie, basically. We'll have a wonderful, contented time in here. I'll love you. Your parents are fucked up. Don't tell them about this stuff, right? But myself and my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old could not come up with this. So I just lost myself at that point, became a fear-based cripple. And the abuse went down. And then that other pattern of adaptation started. And so, the self coming back is part of that. But I think it's important to highlight, right? Higher self didn't come up with a better plan. Self didn't come up with a better plan. 5-year-old didn't come up with a better plan. Parents didn't come up with a better plan. Therapists didn't come up with a better plan. Teachers didn't come up with a better plan. Peers and parents did not come up with a better plan. The government did not come up with a better plan, right? And all the 5-year-old knew was the beating stopped when he was utterly, miserably alone, and escalated when he backlashed or was happy and exuberant, right? So my 5-year-old made the right choice. And then the cult, of course, carries on without ever apologizing, understanding, doing anything about any of this. And when all of this is called love, it's not clear that something needs to be done about it. So I like that Lazaris has done some good work around shame and talks about the true cruelty of parenting. I don't like the lack of real sensitive empathy of what it's like to be that 5-year-old and that they could do nothing else. I don't like the lack of clarity that some part of me that supposedly knows more than me chooses pain and suffering to learn through loneliness. But Lazaris didn't bother to go to them and be their friends up there and say, why didn't you do that, Lazaris? You got no time, right? Go back to this supposed me who's choosing suffering. Give him a chat. Say, do it over here, right? And if your techniques don't work for them either, stop, learn from that. And if they do, right, then you don't need to, come up with all these techniques for 40 years to basically solve this. Like, it all starts with this, right? There is no supposed negative ego without this. Right? There's no shame tapes without this. So if the whole mistake is choosing to learn about loneliness rather than doing something else, the intelligent person stops it at the mistake. It doesn't spend 50 years repairing what was maybe a 5-minute conversation. Should I choose the punishing, abusive parents or the radiant, loving parents? Let's just spend an entire lifetime or 1,000 generations recovering from that as a species. So basically my advocacy is that to the extent that there is fault, it is shared equally throughout the universe. That every part, every person, every part has a role to play. And to the extent that that this is a great success, like we're the cream of the crop of the universe, that's also shared, equally throughout the probability and possibility field. But anyway, I would say this conversation has highlighted this, and I have seen another possibility field that was a luminous one. And since this occurred due to the banishment of self, the reclaiming of self is the biggest medicine to bring the self back into love this child. So that's what I will do. I think that's a useful thing to get to throughout all this.